compartment of forearm. Introduction. Forearm is that part of the upper limb which extends from elbow joint to wrist. The forearm is enclosed with a coat of deep fascia. There are two bones in the forearm, ulna in the medial side and radius in the lateral side. Connecting the two bones, there is a thick membrane known as interosseous membrane. The bones, interosseous membrane, and the deep fascia divides the entire forearm into an anterior compartment and posterior compartment. Surface landmarks of front of forearm. Medial and lateral epicondyle of the humerus. Medial epicondyle is more prominent than the lateral one. Ulnar nerve can be palpated and rolled over the posterior aspect of medial epicondyle of humerus. Biceps brachii tendon can be palpated in front of the elbow. In extended position of the elbow, the hair of the radius can be palpated distal to the lateral epicondyle. Hair of the ulna becomes prominent on the posterior surface of the wrist in pronated hand. Styloid process of radius can be palpated in the anatomical snuff box. Styloid process of ulna is 1 cm above the tip of the styloid process of radius. Its tip can be palpated in the posterior-medial aspect of wrist. Pisiform bone can be felt at the base of the hypothenar eminence. Hook of hamate lies below the pisiform bone. Radial artery pulsation can be felt at the lower part of radius, lateral to the tendon of the flexor carpi radialis. Ulnar artery pulsation can be felt lateral to the insertion of the flexor carpi ulnaris. Palpating radial artery is much easier when compared to palpating ulnar artery. The anterior compartment of the forearm, also known as flexor compartment, contains muscles, nerves, vessels. Muscles. The muscles of the anterior compartment of the forearm are arranged in two groups: superficial group, deep group. Superficial group of muscles. Superficial group contains 5 muscles. These are better memorized if they are remembered from lateral to medial side: pronator teres, flexor carpi radialis, palmaris longus, flexor digitorum superficialis, and flexor carpi ulnaris. Do remember that the flexor digitorum superficialis muscle is present between the superficial and deep group. Hence, some refer to it as intermediate group. All these superficial flexor muscles have a common origin from anterior aspect of the medial epicondyle of the humerus. This is known as common flexor origin. Some muscles, however, have additional origins which will be described in detail. Pronator teres. Origin: it contains 2 heads, humeral and ulnar. Humeral head arises from the lower part of the medial supracondylar ridge and from the common flexor origin. Ulnar head arises from the medial margin of coronoid process of ulna. The 2 heads unite with each other, muscle passes downwards and laterally where it forms medial boundary of the cubital fossa. Median nerve leaves the cubital fossa by passing between the 2 heads of pronator teres. Insertion: the muscle inserts into the lateral surface of radius, where maximum convexity is seen. Nerve supply by median nerve. Actions: as the name suggests, it is the pronator of forearm. Since it crosses elbow joint, it produces weak flexion of forearm at elbow. Flexor carpi radialis. Origin: arises from common flexor origin, that is, from the anterior surface of the medial epicondyle of the humerus. Insertion. At about middle of the arm, the muscle forms a tendon. Tendon passes deep to the flexor retinaculum and is inserted into the bases of second and third metacarpal bones. Nerve supply. Median nerve. Actions. It produces flexion of the wrist when acting singly. When acting with extensor carpi radialis longus and brevis, it produces abduction of the wrist. Palmaris longus. This muscle is sometimes absent. Origin. From common flexor origin. Insertion. The long tendon of the palmaris longus passes in front of the flexor retinaculum. Few fibers are attached to the flexor retinaculum. Then the tendon is continuous with apex of palmar aponeurosis. Nerve supply. Median nerve. Actions. It is a weak flexor of wrist joint. Flexor carpi ulnaris. Origin. It has two heads, humeral and ulnar. Humeral head arises from the common flexor origin. Ulnar head arises from the medial margin of the olecranon process and upper 2/3 of posterior margin of ulna. Ulnar nerve enters the forearm between the two heads of the origin of flexor carpi ulnaris. Insertion. Inserts into the pisiform bone. In fact, the pisiform bone is the sesamoid bone within the tendon of the flexor carpi ulnaris muscle. Through the pisohamate ligament, the insertion extends into the hamate and through the pisometacarpal ligament to the base of the fifth metacarpal bone. Nerve supply. Ulnar nerve. Actions. It produces flexion of the wrist when acting singly. When acting with extensor carpi ulnaris, it produces adduction of the wrist. Flexor digitorum superficialis. This is a broad muscle that is present intermediate with superficial and deep group of muscles. Origin. It has got two heads, humero-ulnar and radial. Humero-ulnar head arises from common flexor origin. Ulnar collateral ligament and medial margin of coronoid process of ulna. Radial head arises from anterior oblique line of the radial shaft. Humero-ulnar and radial head are joined by a fibrous band. Median nerve and ulnar artery passes deep to this fibrous band. Both heads forms muscle belly which end up in four tendons. The tendons are arranged in such a way that tendons for middle and ring fingers are situated anteriorly and tendons of index and little fingers are posterior. All the four tendons pass deep to the flexor retinaculum within the carpal tunnel. Tendons in the tunnel are enveloped by the common synovial sheath. Insertion. Each tendon reaches the base of respective proximal phalanx where it enters the fibrous flexor sheath along with flexor digitorum profundus. The tendon splits into two slips. Flexor digitorum profundus tendon passes between the two slips. The two slips inserts into the palmar aspect of the sides of middle phalanx of medial 4 digits. Nerve supply. Median nerve. Actions. Flexion of middle phalanx at the proximal interphalangeal joint of medial 4 digits. Weak flexion of metacarpophalangeal joint of medial 4 digits. Weak flexor of wrist joint. Deep muscles. There are three muscles in the anterior compartment of forearm, namely flexor digitorum profundus, flexor pollicis longus, and pronator quadratus. These muscles extend from bones of forearm to the hand. Flexor digitorum profundus. This is the largest muscle of anterior compartment of forearm. It forms the bulk of the forearm. Origin. It arises from the anterior and medial surfaces of upper 3/4 of shaft of ulna. From adjacent interosseous membrane. Posterior border of ulna, olecranon and coronoid process. The muscle belly of the profundus divides into 4 tendons in the lower part of forearm. Tendons passes in the carpal tunnel and is enveloped by common synovial sheath, also known as ulnar bursa. In the palm, the tendon gives origin to lumbrical muscles of hand. Insertion. Each tendon enters the fibrous flexor sheath, passes between 2 slips of flexor digitorum superficialis tendon and is inserted into the base of the distal phalanx of medial 4 digits. Nerve supply. It has got dual nerve supply. Medial half is supplied by ulnar nerve. Lateral half is supplied by anterior interosseous nerve, a branch of median nerve. Actions. Flexion of distal interphalangeal joint of medial 4 digits. Flexion of proximal interphalangeal joint of medial 4 digits. Flexion of wrist joint. Flexor pollicis longus. Origin. This muscle arises from the anterior surface of radius below the anterior oblique line, from adjacent interosseous membrane. It forms a tendon above the wrist. The tendon passes through the carpal tunnel where it is enveloped by a separate synovial sheath known as radial bursa. Insertion. The tendon enters the fibrous flexor sheath at the base of proximal phalanx of the thumb. It inserts into the base of distal phalanx of thumb. Nerve supply. By anterior interosseous nerve, a branch of median nerve. Action. Flexion of distal phalanx of thumb. Flexion of metacarpophalangeal joint. And flexion of wrist joint. Pronator quadratus. It is quadrilateral shaped muscle. It is located in the lower part of the forearm. Origin. It arises from the bony ridge on anterior surface of lower 1/4 of shaft of ulna. Insertion. Inserts into the lower 1/4 of anterior surface of radius. The anterior interosseous nerve descends behind the posterior surface of the muscle. Space of perona and deep forearm space lies between the long flexor tendons and anterior surface of pronator quadratus. Nerve supply. By anterior interosseous nerve, a branch of median nerve. Actions. Chief pronator of forearm. Nerves in the anterior compartment of forearm. Superficial branch of radial nerve. It is the terminal branch of the radial nerve arising in the cubital fossa, under cover of brachioradialis muscle. It is sensory nerve. Course and relations. It passes downwards over the supinator, pronator teres, radial head of flexor digitorum superficialis, and flexor pollicis longus muscle. nerve is related to the lateral side of radial artery in the middle one-third of forearm. About 7 cm above the wrist, it passes deep into the tendon of brachioradialis and curves around the lateral side of radius and enters the dorsum of hand. In the dorsum of the hand, superficial branch of radial nerve gives 4 to 5 digital branches. Distribution. It supplies the lateral half of dorsum of hand, proximal parts of dorsal surfaces of thumb, index finger and lateral half of middle finger. Ulnar nerve. Ulnar nerve is also known as musician's nerve as it supplies the muscles which control fine movements of the fingers. Course and relations. It enters the forearm by passing between the two heads of flexor carpi ulnaris. It courses downwards along the medial side of the forearm where it lies between flexor digitorum profundus medially and flexor digitorum superficialis laterally. In the lower part, it becomes superficial, covered by fascia and skin. It passes superficial to the flexor retinaculum along with ulnar artery where it is covered by superficial slip of flexor retinaculum known as volar carpal ligament. The canal formed here is known as Guyon's canal, which is present lateral to the pisiform bone. Ulnar nerve and artery are separated in the upper third but courses together in the lower 2/3. Branches. Muscular branches to the flexor carpi ulnaris and medial half of flexor digitorum profundus. Articular branches to elbow joint. Cutaneous branches. Palmar cutaneous branch arises in the middle of forearm. It supplies the skin over the hypothenar eminence. Dorsal cutaneous branch arises 7.5 cm above the wrist, winds backward and supplies the proximal part of medial 2.5 fingers and adjoining areas of dorsum of hand. Median nerve. This is the chief nerve of the front of forearm. It supplies all muscles of anterior compartment except flexor carpi ulnaris and medial half of flexor digitorum profundus. Since the muscles of forearm are involved in physical work, it is also known as laborer's nerve. Course and relations. The nerve lies medial to the brachial artery in the cubital fossa. It leaves the cubital fossa by passing between the humeral and ulnar heads of pronator teres muscle. Then it passes between the fibrous band connecting the radial and humero-ulnar heads of flexor digitorum superficialis. It courses downwards by adhering to the posterior surface of flexor digitorum superficialis anterior to the flexor digitorum profundus. It is accompanied by the median artery, a small branch from anterior interosseous artery. At about 5 cm above the wrist, the nerve emerges from the lateral aspect of flexor digitorum superficialis. Here, it is overlapped by tendon of palmaris longus and laterally related to the tendon of flexor carpi radialis. The median nerve enters the palm by passing through the carpal tunnel deep to the flexor retinaculum. Branches. Muscular branches to the flexor carpi radialis, palmaris longus, and flexor digitorum superficialis. Anterior interosseous nerve. Articular branches to the elbow joint and proximal radio-ulnar joint. Palmar cutaneous branch arises above the flexor retinaculum. It passes superficial to the flexor retinaculum and supplies the skin over the thinner eminence and central part of palm. Communicating branch to the ulnar nerve. anterior interosseous nerve. It arises from the median nerve when median nerve is leaving the cubital fossa. It is accompanied by the anterior interosseous artery, a branch of ulnar artery. It descends downwards on the anterior surface of the interosseous membrane. It passes posterior to the pronator quadratus muscle to end in the front of the wrist. It supplies the deep muscles of front of forearm except medial half of flexor digitorum profundus. Provides articular branches to distal radio-ulnar, wrist joint and intercarpal joints. Arteries of front of forearm. Prominent arteries in forearm are radial and ulnar arteries. However, these arteries are mainly destined to supply the hand. Arterial supply of forearm is mainly derived by common interosseous artery. Anterior interosseous artery, a branch of common interosseous artery, supplies most of the front of forearm. Radial artery. Origin. It is a smaller terminal branch of brachial artery. It arises in the cubital fossa at the level of neck of radius. Course. The radial artery extends from the level of neck of radius downwards to the wrist with the lateral convexity. It leaves the forearm by turning posteriorly and enters the anatomical snuff box. The radial pulse is felt on the anterior surface of distal end of radius lateral to the tendon of flexor carpi radialis. Relations in forearm. Anteriorly, in the proximal part, the artery is covered by the brachioradialis muscle. In the distal part, it is covered only by fasciae and skin. Posteriorly, the artery is related to tendon of biceps brachii, supinator, pronator teres, flexor digitorum superficialis, flexor pollicis longus, pronator quadratus, and anterior surface of lower end of radius. Laterally, the artery is related to brachioradialis. In the middle third, it is related to superficial branch of radial nerve. Medially, the radial artery is related to pronator teres in the upper part to the tendon of flexor carpi radialis in the lower part. Branches. Radial recurrent artery. It arises in the cubital fossa. It runs upwards deep to brachioradialis and takes part in anastomosis in front of lateral epicondyle of humerus with radial collateral artery. Muscular branches to the muscles of the lateral side of forearm. Palmar carpal branch arises at the level of lower border of pronator quadratus, passes deep to the tendons of flexor muscles and anastomosis with the palmar carpal branch of ulnar artery. Dorsal carpal branch, it passes backwards deep to the flexor tendons and takes part in dorsal carpal arc by anastomosing with the dorsal carpal branch of ulnar artery. Superficial palmar branch. It arises when the radial artery is leaving the forearm. It passes through the thenar muscles and completes the superficial palmar arc by joining the terminal part of ulnar artery. Ulnar artery. Origin. It is the larger terminal branch of brachial artery. It arises in the cubital fossa at the level of neck of radius. Course. The ulnar artery passes obliquely downwards and medially in the upper one-third. In the lower one-third, it has a vertical course. It descends vertically downwards. It passes superficial to the flexor retinaculum and enters the palm just lateral to the pisiform bone. The artery can be palpated at this joint. Relations. Anteriorly, the upper oblique part of the ulnar artery is related to the muscles that arise from medial epicondyle of humerus, that is pronator teres, flexor carpi radialis, palmaris longus, and flexor digitorum superficialis, and to the median nerve. The vertical part of the artery is covered only by skin and fascia. Posteriorly, the artery is related to brachialis, flexor digitorum profundus, and flexor retinaculum. Laterally, the artery is related to flexor digitorum superficialis. Medially, it is related to flexor carpi ulnaris and ulnar nerve. Branches. Anterior ulnar recurrent artery. It passes upwards and anastomoses with the inferior ulnar collateral artery in front of medial epicondyle of humerus. Posterior ulnar recurrent artery. It anastomoses with the superior ulnar collateral artery behind the medial epicondyle of humerus. Common interosseous artery. Muscular branches to the muscles of medial side of forearm. Palmar and dorsal carpal branches take part in the anastomosis around the wrist joint. Palmar carpal branch anastomoses with palmar carpal branch of the radial artery to form palmar carpal arc. Dorsal carpal branch arises just above the pisiform bone. It passes backwards deep to the flexor tendons and takes part in dorsal carpal arc by anastomosing with the dorsal carpal branch of radial artery. Common interosseous artery. Origin. It is a branch of ulnar artery. Arises just below the radial tuberosity. Course. It has a short course of 1 centimeter. It passes towards the upper border of interosseous membrane. Termination. At the upper border of interosseous membrane, it divides into anterior and posterior interosseous artery. Anterior interosseous artery. It is one of the terminal branch of common interosseous artery. It descends downwards in the deeper part of the front of forearm on the interosseous membrane. It is accompanied by the anterior interosseous nerve. The artery is situated between the flexor digitorum profundus and flexor pollicis longus. When it reaches the upper border of pronator quadratus, it pierces the interosseous membrane and enters the posterior compartment of forearm. Branches. Median artery. Arises in the upper part and it accompanies the median nerve. This is the axial artery of the upper limb. Muscular branches to the deep muscles of front of forearm. Nutrient arteries to ulnar and radius. Carpal branch which takes part in palmar carpal arch.